Thank you so much, and thank you for that generous introduction. I hope you can all forgive me for bringing my morning coffee up with me. I am so happy to be here to be speaking today. It's really exciting to have flown over from London and to finally have the opportunity to see and engage with the exhibition. And as mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the construct of normality. As also mentioned, I wrote a book called Mad World, which looks at the politics of mental health. And a very kind of central part of this book is looking at this idea of how do we construct this concept of health and normality? Where did this come from? How is this tied to capitalism, to our broader politics? And actually, should we take this idea of health or normality at face value? Should we actually try and interrogate this and kind of break it apart? Today I'm going to be speaking in a slightly kind of different way, not just looking at my book though. I'm also going to talk a bit about my personal experiences as a black person, as a queer person, and as someone who identifies as disabled. And I want to kind of draw on some of these experiences to, I guess, give more of a personal reflection on how an individual relates to normality. And yeah, I think that this talk will also kind of tie really nicely to the section of the exhibition on self-perception and practices of recognition, which again looks at this kind of idea of normality and kind of societal, mental, and physical standards. So to begin, so I wanted to start with a personal kind of anecdote about a research project that I was involved in when I was a student. So in my final year of university, for my dissertation, I had to be involved in a psychology research project, and I joined a project that was on queer families. And a kind of central aim of this research was to interrogate or ask the question, do queer families, so families with lesbian mothers or gay fathers, do they produce children who are well-adjusted? And this is obviously a very kind of contentious or kind of loaded language, but the question was, yeah, do they produce children who are likely to have emotional difficulties, behavioral difficulties? And the conclusion of this research was no. So through various interviews and kind of different quantitative analysis, we found on the project that children of queer parents were no more likely to kind of have behavioral or emotional difficulties than children of straight parents. And this is something that I was, I was obviously a third-year university student, so I wasn't, leading this project in any way. But I felt very proud to be involved in it. I felt that it was kind of a very important thing in terms of producing research that makes the case for the civil rights of queer people. That actually queer families are no worse than heterosexual families. Their children do just as well. And this being kind of like an argument towards the assimilation and rights of queer people. This picture is from a protest in Canada that was in the 1980s. And the protest was around the fact that lesbian mothers' children were frequently being taken away by the state. The argument was, counter to the research that we did, the argument was that their children would not be well adjusted, that they needed a father figure. And I wanted to include this picture because I feel like it gives really good context for where research like this came from and kind of the need or the desire for psychological research that actually proved, no, queer children do just as well. But I think it's interesting that as I've got a bit older, I've started to feel a bit more complicated about this research and started to question it a little bit more. And to wonder actually, while it came from a context that, like I said, it seemed like it was very necessary, actually kind of what are the drawbacks or the negative kind of repercussions of this argument that actually queer people are normal. They produce normal children who can be assimilated into a kind of capitalist society. This next image is from a show called Modern Family. How many people in the room have seen Modern Family? Okay, a few fans. So those who have seen the show will know that this is a still that's an image of a gay couple in the show, and they adopt a child called Lily. And I wanted to give this example not because I have any particular issue with the show itself, but because I think it's a really clear example of how, in a contemporary context, we are more and more familiar with images of queer families as normal. The idea here is that queer families, queer parents can have children, they can raise happy children. Here we've got a kind of very white, able-bodied middle-class representation of queerness that is very palatable to kind of mainstream society. And again, I kind of want to interrogate and ask this question of, it's not necessarily that these representations are straightforwardly negative, but what comes along with this argument that we are normal, we are safe, there's nothing to worry about here. And so, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the construct of normality and its history, which I'm going to go on to now. So normality, while it kind of seems like a kind of benign or objective concept, it's a relatively new historical concept. It's not something that always existed. And I take a quote here from a philosopher called Robert Chapman's very good book, which came out last year, which is called Empire of Normality. And they say, I might have to turn a little bit to read this one. Today, disability and disorder are understood in relation to concepts of statistical or medical normality. Yet, in fact, there was no such conception in the ancient world. The idea of normal functioning, or more concretely, the normal heart rate, normal lung capacity, normal height, normal cognitive ability, and so forth, would have been wholly alien to medics of antiquity. And Chapman talks a bit in their book about the ideas that kind of predated normality. So they reference, for example, in ancient Greece, there was more of a focus on balance. The way we conceptualize the body was very focused on balancing the four humours, the idea that we have bile, phlegm, blood, and these are things that can be thrown out of harmony within an individual or be brought back into harmony. And they say actually it was only around the 19th century that this idea of normality as we know it today really became solidified. So they draw on a few different people. Firstly, a statistician called Curators, who published a book in the 19th century called The Average Man. And he was very focused on doing this kind of research around the Scottish population, and he kind of created this idea of statistically, what does the average Scotsman look like? And I think it's interesting also that the average man, right there we've got in the title, the average person is considered to be a man. And that touches upon the idea that there are, ideas like maleness, able-bodiedness, heterosexuality. All of these things are subtly weaved into who we think of as the average person. Curators also came up with this idea of kind of the norm being in a kind of statistical middle point. So here we've got a bell curve, which is what we often use to represent the average. And Curators also interestingly came up with BMI, body mass index, which is still used in many countries to measure what a normal or healthy weight is. And so moving on from Curators, then there was the development of phrenology, psychiatry, various other ways of measuring and kind of categorizing what is the norm and what lies outside of the norm. So I've just got a few examples here, like Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, an example of kind of what was seen to be the norm or ideal body proportions for a man. But also up on the left-hand side, I've got a foundational text on psychiatry by a physician called Emil Kraepelin. And Kraepelin was very influenced by Francis Galton, who is widely known as the founder of the eugenics movement. And Kraepelin's idea was that there is a normal mind, there is a normal way of behaving, of experiencing and perceiving the world, and that those who laid outside of this norm had what were considered to be psychological diseases. And so these are the foundations of the discipline of psychiatry, this idea there is a normal way of being and an abnormal way of being. Then moving on from Kraepelin, we've got phrenology. Like I said, this was hugely kind of influential in the eugenics movement and a lot of these eugenic thinkers, but it was also quite popularized in kind of the mainstream population. And it introduced this kind of idea that we can compare, for example, people's skull sizes, the various kind of lumps and bumps on people's skulls, to say something about who you are as a person. And Chapman argues in their book that this was kind of central to popularizing this idea that we all sit within a kind of statistical collective and we all fall somewhere on this kind of bell curve. And then above, I've got an example, kind of depiction of a concept called degeneration theory, which was also very popular among eugenicists. The idea here was that there are people who would be called, quote, degenerates. Obviously, this is very loaded language. This included racialized people, people that we would now consider to be disabled, but also people who fell outside of moral norms. So women who were engaged in sex work were often seen to represent degeneracy. Also women who were generally seen to be kind of unruly or not conforming to the standards of the time were seen to be degenerate. But also here you can see in this depiction, degeneration was also seen as generally a kind of social phenomenon. There was this idea that if people who represented degeneracy reproduced too much, that society itself would degenerate, would, as they would phrase it, revert to a more primitive form of being. And so there was a big kind of emphasis on civilization and resisting degeneracy. So I also want to talk a little bit about the consequences of these perceptions of normality and this kind of enforcement of a norm. So here, this is an image of women who were institutionalized in what at the time were called mental hospitals or lunatic asylums. And this happened kind of across Europe in quite large numbers. But also this example is from Mussolini's Italy in the early 20th century. And many, many women were institutionalized under this regime. They were said to be mentally ill, to be mad, often on the basis of them not conforming to societal norms for women. So there was this idea of female deviancy that was often discussed. And this might include women who, had children out of wedlock, were seen to represent sexual deviancy, or were kind of more broadly, or like in a more difficult to define way, women who were just seen to kind of not fulfill the ideals of motherhood or good womanhood. And many women lived their entire lives in these institutions. And then I also wanted to give another example of the consequences of these concepts of normality in the earlier 20th century. So I'm not from Berlin, so this memorial was new to me, but I'm sure for many people in the room, this is familiar, a memorial to the victims of the Action T4 program in Nazi Germany. And this included people that we would now consider to be disabled, people who also would now be considered to experience mental distress or mental illness. And a statistic that I find really staggering from this era in history, which I included in the book, was that between 73% and 100% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia were killed under the Nazi regime. And so I think that's another really clear example of how this kind of, at one point, vague and fluid concept of normality became solidified in history and saw violence and murder as the result. I also wanted to talk a little bit about not only eugenics and kind of scientific racism in our ideas of normality, but also how capitalism and the capitalist economic system has also played a role in kind of solidifying this idea of who is normal and who is not normal. So this is a very good book called The Politics of Disablement by a disability theorist called Mike Oliver. And in this book, he was kind of one of the first to put forward a theory of disability that suggested that disability was constructed in line with the capitalist economic system. And so he argued, looking at feudalism in England, he argued that actually under the feudal system, where lots of production was domestic or took place in the agricultural sphere, people that we now consider to be disabled were often actually integrated into production and integrated into broader society. He gives a few kind of different examples. For example, people who are deaf, often he argued would still be able to observe, even if not through hearing, observe how to engage in certain parts of agricultural and domestic work and learn through watching. He argued that, for example, in the home, which was a slower environment of production, where people had more kind of autonomy over their working conditions, again, people who are visually impaired or blind might be able to go at their own pace or be familiar with the environment around them, and again, participate in production. And he argued that even those who might not be able to participate in the process of production could be cared for in the home, because again, the home was the environment where most people were working. And then Oliver's kind of big argument is that during the Industrial Revolution, when people were sent into factories to work, and suddenly the home was no longer kind of the central site of work, it was the industrial factory, he argues that lots of people were no longer able to participate in production. So the examples I gave before, people who are deaf, people who are visually impaired, but also people who were considered to be mad or mentally ill, anyone who didn't fit into this kind of very rigid way of producing and working became excluded from production. And additionally to that, because people who were considered to be able-bodied as well were also being pushed to work in the factory, they could no longer stay at home and care for disabled relatives. So this is kind of the moment in history where you see this huge explosion in asylums. Because I guess you've got this question of, if able-bodied people are being pushed into the factory and so can't perform caring roles, and disabled people are excluded from this production process, then where do these people go? What do we do with people who can't produce and can't be cared for? The answer to that in the 19th century was, like I said, what were once called lunatic asylums, or disability asylums. These were spaces where people who were considered to have mental illness, to be mad, or to experience physical, intellectual disability, were essentially warehoused. Often we kind of talk about these spaces as if they were spaces of care or treatment, but they were primarily, in terms of their economic function, a space to hold people who couldn't go to work and couldn't be cared for in the home. And this image is from Bedlam, which is now or sometimes called Bethlehem Hospital, but it's the world's oldest asylum. And there were often kind of, it became quite notorious for having really bad conditions. And this is kind of an older depiction of what the conditions were like. So I think it's important when we look at this history of kind of where did this idea of normality come from, and how did we respond to people who are not considered to be normal? I think it's important that we see kind of present day as being a continuation from the past rather than kind of a completely different context. Because I think this is something I kind of thought about a lot while I was writing the book. This question of, I often felt, why do people talk about asylums like they are this kind of relic of the past? Why do people kind of discuss them like our approach to mental health and to disability is completely different today? When actually I think there's a lot of continuation. So in most countries across Europe, we still have institutionalization of people with mental health problems, but also in the terms of physical health as well. I look at the example of the National Health Service in the UK, which is a free health service to engage with. However, I argue that this service is very much focused on, rather than actually making people healthy, well, letting us flourish, letting us have autonomy, I think that this system is actually primarily focused on getting people back to work. I think this is like particularly obvious in the sphere of mental health. So if you go to a doctor in the UK with a mental health complaint, which I think is now half of GP appointments are for mental health, you will most likely be offered medication. And obviously medication works for some people, it's kind of some people's preferred method of treatment, but in the UK at least, it is the dominant method of treatment. It is kind of one of the only options you're often presented with. And that is because A, medication is cheap, but B, it has been demonstrated to be quite effective at getting people back to work, kind of back to normality, back to functioning, quite effectively and quickly. And I think that kind of begs the question, what if you would prefer to engage in, for example, psychoanalysis, or a more kind of involved form of therapy that might involve you getting worse before you get better, or getting better very slowly. And so, I think that when we look at our present-day health systems, this concept of normality, getting people back to capitalist, productive normality, is still really central. So, after kind of looking at this history, I wanted to kind of think a little bit about our present-day kind of relationship to normality. And I think this is where the kind of really personal element comes in for me, because this question of how do we relate to normality, I think still feels quite complicated. And I want to kind of go back to the study that I mentioned and think about kind of the complexity of that question. The context in which lesbian mothers are having their children taken away from them, a context that kind of calls for this demonstration that, no, we are normal, we can produce healthy children, we can be assimilated into mainstream society. I kind of want to hold space for how, I guess, necessary and difficult that might feel. But I also want to kind of push against the idea of normality due to this history and kind of, I guess, problematize the idea that we should be making appeals to normality. So this is an artwork by an artist called Dolly Sen, who is in the UK context and kind of creates what she calls mad art. And this is a piece of work that was called Help the Normals. And she exhibited it at the Wellcome Collection in London. But she also did this kind of performance-based element where she kind of roamed around the streets of London with this collection tin and said, we need to help the normals. Will anyone donate? We need to save the normals. And I think that that's like a really interesting subversion of dominant ideas we see about disability, right? So in disability studies, we often refer to the charity model. And this idea that it's very normalized that disabled people are presented as victims, as helpless, as people who need to be saved by able-bodied people and mainstream society. And I think she really turns that on its head and actually says, well, what if actually normal people are the people who need helping and saving? But I also want to draw attention to this piece of work because I think it kind of points towards this attitude that I've seen a lot in kind of my circles, which are kind of disability justice circles, queer circles, anti-racist circles in the UK. This idea that normality is kind of something to be joked about or derided. So people often talk about kind of in queer communities, normies being this kind of like very derisive term that refers to people who are seen to be very engaged in kind of mainstream culture and not necessarily questioning mainstream values. And so I think we see here this idea that normality is not necessarily the be-all and end-all, is not necessarily good. I think I see this idea circulating a lot. But I think we should still kind of think about history and the extent to which these ideas have kind of been tried and tested. Should we reject normality? Should we embrace it? So to give another example, beyond the kind of queer families example, I write a lot in my book about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is a manual that is primarily used by psychiatrists to diagnose mental illness. This manual kind of dates all the way back to the early 20th century. And it was very controversial in the kind of 1970s that homosexuality was still included in this manual. So homosexuality was considered to be a disease or a mental disorder that was in need of cure and was not a kind of normal state of being. So in the late 1970s, there was a lot of kind of contestation around the inclusion of homosexuality in this manual. There began to be lots of protests from kind of queer civil rights groups that wanted homosexuality to be removed. And some of this was rooted in very material concern. So, for example, conversion therapies were kind of justified and normalized through the fact that homosexuality was included in the manual and considered to be a disease in need of cure. So I think I have a lot of sympathy with this kind of campaign that emerged to have homosexuality removed from the DSM. But simultaneously, I want to kind of draw on some kind of newer theorists, including a queer and disability theorist called A.J. Lewis, who kind of critiques some of this campaign as well, or critiques some of the messaging that emerged from this. So you can see in this sign here, homo is healthy, which kind of, again, subtly kind of reinforces this idea that firstly, health is something good and kind of an objective concept. And also that queer people are healthy, normal, kind of non-threatening to our society. And so AJ kind of talks about in their research the pitfalls of this. So through saying, for example, homo is healthy, there is nothing wrong with us as queer people, there is kind of this subtle reinforcement of the idea that there is something wrong and abject about disability. There is something wrong about madness. And you see this a lot in kind of the campaigning materials from the time, people saying things like, we're not mad, we're not sick, so we should not be subject to conversion therapy, to forced therapy. We should not be subject to institutionalization. And while I agree with the latter half of that statement, I think the kind of tacking on of we're not mad and we're not sick, and so we shouldn't be treated this way, subtly kind of disavows and reinforces the kind of treatment or poor treatment of mad, sick, and disabled people. And this was kind of borne out at the time in the movement. AJ again talks about in their research the fact that there was a lot of collaboration at the time between queer movements and between what were called mad movements, which were made up of patients who were advocating for their own rights. There was a lot of kind of solidarity between these two movements. However, when homosexuality was removed from the DSM, there was a kind of fracturing from these movements. Those bonds of solidarity didn't stay. It was kind of this idea of, okay, gay people have won this liberation struggle, and so engaging with, for example, challenges to psychiatry, challenges to medicine, are no longer kind of relevant to the gay movement. I also want to flag, I think, kind of something that I think is very important about this removal of homosexuality from the DSM, which is that trans people actually remained in the DSM. So transness continued to be pathologized as a mental illness or a mental disorder. And I think that's kind of another example of a form of disavowal, how kind of winning the civil rights for one group meant that another group stayed kind of being pathologized. And almost kind of this removal of homosexuality ended up being framed as kind of, that was a mistake, but everything else that is in the DSM is legitimate. This is real science. This shouldn't be challenged. And so, yeah, I think that this case is like something that really points towards the complexity of that question of, should we appeal to normality, appeal to assimilation, or should we actually try and hold solidarity and pose a kind of more radical challenge? So I think that this question is quite complicated, and I think that I kind of want to make the case, while holding the complicatedness of the question, make the case for something that's more radical, involves more solidarity, and involves more fundamental challenge to the kind of core structures of society. I think one of the dangers of this argument that queerness is healthy, is normal, is non-threatening, can be kind of assimilated into social reproduction within capitalist society. One of the dangers is that it can be co-opted. So we see, for example, what people often refer to as rainbow capitalism, queerness suddenly being used as a tool of marketing or a tool to actually uphold and justify the capitalist economic system. We also see, for example, pinkwashing, queerness being used to justify the violence of nation states towards citizens. And I think that when we hold solidarity and say, actually, what if queerness were something disruptive, disorderly, and I say disorderly to mean falling outside of the dominant societal order, something that's challenging, when we do that, is there more radical potential contained within that? And so here I use a kind of example from a pride protest where people say queer liberation, not rainbow capitalism. Liberation is actually something kind of more disruptive, more demanding than this assimilationist kind of asking for our rights politely approach. And so, yeah, I kind of wanted to draw on a quote from an academic called David Halperin, who says, "We need to admit our pleasure in being the lowest of the low, in being bad, in being outlaws, in betraying both our own values and those of the people around us." I quite like this quote because I think there's something about it that feels like very subversive. It feels also kind of on the level of affect, that it appeals to this idea of badness, of immorality, of leaning into those kind of feelings of shame or of being kind of an outcast from society. I quite like that. Like, I think there's something in that that feels almost that, I don't know, that is instilled with the level of pride. It's like this pride and shame coexisting with one another. And I think, want to kind of draw on this call to say, I think that there's really something in that, in embracing disorderliness. And I think that disorderliness necessarily involves kind of holding solidarity with others who are seen to be outside of the dominant societal order. And like I said, while I think this is a complicated question, I think this is the direction that when I think about, for example, that research project that I was involved in, this is the direction that I feel I want to move in. To not just say, okay, queer people, we are normal, we are productive, we can contribute to capitalist society, and so there's nothing to worry about here kind of thing. What if the statement was actually, there is something to worry about here? That we can be threatening to the dominant societal order, that we can pose a radical disruption, and that also that radical disruption does not only pertain to our own rights, pertains to the rights of others and the liberation of others. And I think that there's something really powerful in that. And yeah, I think I would just like to kind of conclude with the final thought that disorderliness and our ability to disrupt, while I think can feel very difficult, can feel shameful, can involve a kind of a more difficult struggle, I think that that is really where our power lies. And I think that that embrace of disorder is something that, yeah, I'm really moving towards and encourage others to move towards too. Thank you.